Welcome to Scale Her Up, the Female Entrepreneurs Show with me, Brenda Hector. I'm a business growth specialist, helping business owners to develop themselves and grow their businesses so they can achieve their goals and enjoy the lifestyle they dream of. I'm on a mission to revolutionise the entrepreneurial landscape for women in business. In every episode, I interview someone who has an inspiring story or some great advice for women aiming to start or scale their businesses. If you're new to the show, take a moment to subscribe right now so you don't miss any upcoming episodes, and please check out the previous ones after listening to this. We have an awesome Facebook community. Just search for Scale Her Up and join in. Welcome to Scale Her Up. I'm Brenda Hector, and with me today I've got Adriana Uribe from Grampian Regional Equality Council. Adriana, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, Grampian Regional Equality Council, I'm thinking it might be one of those that does what it says on the tin, but tell me what you're all about, what you do and why.
Yeah, very much what it says in the tin. So basically, during the last 40 years, the Grampian Regional Equality Council has been working towards supporting any efforts related with equality and obviously trying to fight discrimination, particularly in the northeast of Scotland.
The purpose of my podcast is to encourage women to start their businesses and to scale up, to redress the imbalance in entrepreneurship. So I guess there's a nice similarity between what you do, but there are many more groups that are at a disadvantage than only women, and many people might not see the Grampian region as being a place where that would be, that prevalent.
No.
So yeah,
absolutely. Yes. In fact, there is more than the eye can meet in many ways. Part of what we have done is we have developed research into trying to see how fair is the Northeast. And as you said, I mean, many times certain percentages or certain segments of the population will not realize that actually there are elements of discrimination that are happening, or that there are obstacles that are a little bit more obstacles than that they would be to the norm in terms of the population. Aberdeen happens to be incredibly diverse. There was a statistic I remember reading at some point about more something like 6 out of 10 people living in Aberdeen are not from Aberdeen. And when you talk about the difficulties that perhaps women may experience when they are trying to become entrepreneurs, is not only women, but it's also people who belong to minorities, to communities, minorities, either because they are ethnic minorities, or because they have a disability, or because they are neurodiverse, or because they have a particular, a specific sexual orientation. All of those could create certain obstacles that are not necessarily visible, but they do exist. So yes, there are more populations and there are more elements into that could deter people from trying. If you are part of a minority, you might feel a little bit more or not be as safe, or feel as safe or as secure as you think that you would be if you would be in a community that is just like you. That makes you feel that, you have all the advantages and everything works exactly the same way for everyone. And the reality is a little bit different from that.
So tell me, what are you doing then actively to make things equal and fair?
We have run lots of projects throughout the last 40 years, and mainly all of them are dedicated to focus precisely on those difficulties and those obstacles that minorities may experience. And when we say minorities is not really the right word, isn't it? Because if we think about women, we are 50% of the population, so it's really not a minority. But there are elements there that actually could make things harder. So if you think about something that has become kind of a fashion word at the moment, unfortunately, fashion is not the right word, but it's intersectionality. So whilst, we talk about the idea of being an entrepreneur, a woman also typically would be looking after children and would be looking after the family and will be cleaning and will be having to prepare things at home. And this is not to say that men don't do it, but historically, the idea is that women have been doing a particular type of tasks that perhaps the other half, the males, are not doing. So when we talk about those obstacles, there is a lot of elements that need to be taken into consideration. In my particular case, working with the language and integration side of things, if you have, for example, a language barrier, that is also something that has a massive impact, because if you don't think about it because you speak all the time, you know, that's not a problem. But when you start realizing that, how would things go for you if you were, for example, to be going to live in another country with a completely different language and have to start from scratch? It's quite a different panorama, because we're not talking about the idea of being tourists anymore. We're talking about the idea that you move to a different country and you have to start from scratch. So there are lots of different elements of obstacles that Greg has been working with. Among the projects that we manage, for example, in my particular area, I work with language and integration. So we provide opportunities for people not even to learn the language, which very often people have certain knowledge of English, but then when it comes to have to speak on the phone, for example, it could be quite difficult, because it's something that all of a sudden overwhelms you. You don't have the information from your body language. You don't have the face expressions and so on. So the idea is to create programs that allow people to become more confident with their language abilities. Parallel to that, there are also programs that are helping to support people on one-to-one basis, because obviously the conditions of every individual are going to be different. So it's not only about the language barriers, but there could be personal circumstances that need to be addressed. There could be people that need support because they have PTSD, for example, because of previous circumstances, and so on and so forth. So there are many different areas in which we work, all of them connected with the idea of addressing discrimination and addressing the barriers that stop people from being able to move forward. It is important also to mention the idea of influencing policy, because of course, if policies continue to be the same way, then they are not going to create any change or provide the support for whoever needs it beyond the boundaries or what is already established.
So I'm seeing maybe 3, and there are maybe more. You educate me if there are more. So there's an opportunity to support or to help the people, either the minorities or the people who are discriminated or the people that are having particular challenges. There's the opportunity to speak to policymakers and make sure that you know, from a government or a council perspective or something, that everything's as fair as it can be. But there's maybe also the opportunity to educate the general public who might not be aware of the challenges that people are having.
Yes, absolutely. That will be another program in addition to the things I have mentioned before, and that's what has to do with training. So it's also about learning about cultural awareness and learning about our unconscious bias, which is something that has become more popular lately because people are starting to realize that exists. And then, of course, what has to do with intersectionality, learn what is the legislation connected with equalities, which is something that, you know, for example, in the third sector and in the public sector is something that is at the base of what they do. But the private sector is just catching up, even though it's part of the legislation that will be governing everything that they do. So those are areas where we are starting to also intervene, or not intervene, but rather offer some training, offer some perspective on for people to understand what it is, because often it could happen that becomes just a tick box exercise, but people don't necessarily realize the impact that this can have in other population, and that puts people in disadvantage.
I had a very interesting conversation at a conference last week. It was a little workshop part designed to get people thinking out of the box and get people coming together and throwing ideas together. And they had a few topics that we had to discuss, but one of them was, what if you had to change sex at the age of 30? How would the world be different if you change from a man to a woman, or whatever, at the age of 30? And it got some really interesting conversation going, but it actually raised, like the men had very little realization of how, well, it wouldn't really, would it change? It'll change. I could have rattled
Absolutely.
many things that would have changed, but just by getting people to think differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is
Yeah.
a brilliant book called Invisible Women. Probably you have heard about it because it's quite brilliant. And one of the things that really was interesting was how the author was introducing the idea of how, for example, in the past, people in the United States basically used to live in suburbs, and then the men will be commuting to the city center. And so buses will go from the suburbs to the city center. And it's interesting because when I was reading that, I realized that in Aberdeen itself, this is very much the case still, which makes no sense. So whenever you want to go anywhere in Aberdeen, you first have to take a bus that takes you to the city center before you can take another bus that will take you to somewhere else. Now, that doesn't seem to be anything major. But as you said, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of, for example, a single mom that has to drop off the children in nursery or school and then has to go to work. And if it happens that she works in another, let's call it suburb, so a place that is different from the city center, she would have to do the same thing. She would have to drop off the children in school and then take a bus to the center, and from the center take the bus to work, and then from work go back to the center before she can go back to pick up the children, and so on and so forth. And it's just those little things, those exercises where people have to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else are incredibly useful. So we do a lot of that, particularly when we're talking about cultural awareness, because it's very difficult to understand what other culture may be like. But there is also that risk of believing that a culture means that if you are from this particular culture, you're going to behave like everybody else in that culture, which is not right. We may be Scottish, or we may be Spanish, or we may be Latin American, or we may be Asian. It doesn't mean that because we have that nationality, we are all going to behave in the same way. So it is a way those exercises are really helpful because they realize that we also need to respect individuality.
So what about you then? How did because you're obviously not a local Aberdonian, so you're what's your journey? How did you come to be working with Greg? And
well, it's been a very long journey, because before arriving in the UK, I lived in several parts of the world. So I was living in the Middle East, I lived in the Far East, I have lived in other countries in Latin America besides my home country. And so that gave me a great perspective, because it allowed me to understand that this cultural awareness was something else than just the idea of you belong to a different culture and I need to know this other culture. It allowed me to expand my vision in terms of what this means and what equality means and what it means to respect the position of other people and the observations and the points of view of other people. Arriving in Greg, when I arrived in Greg, I began with something that is called a language cafe. And our local language cafe here in Aberdeen is quite popular because it's a place where we just invite people to come and sit and practice English. We're not teaching them. We are not going to be teaching them because it's not classes. But the idea of having a space that is comfortable, that is free, that is safe, had a huge impact because, as I said, most people have learned some English. Doesn't matter where they come from. Normally, they have a certain level of familiarity with English, but it doesn't mean that they feel that they have the guts to use it. It's scary. It's a scary perspective to be from another country and having to speak in a second language that is not your own and having to communicate and to express. However, the language cafes began to be more popular, and at the moment they are going quite well. We meet every Thursday. We have activities that actually help people to feel more confident. And not only that, there is people that actually would be making friends within that space, or they will be learning about different services and opportunities that are in the city that are not necessarily accessible otherwise. And our idea was to create a space that was going to allow people to access information that was useful more than anything. And of course, parallel to that is the idea of having a space when you feel comfortable, when you can have, you know, a normal conversation with someone without having to be worried about whether you are using the right words, or you know, if people understand you, if people are going to correct you, nothing like that. So that's how I started. And things have been going, you know, at a really fast pace, if I think about it, because even though I had been with Greg for 6 years, when I look back at how things started, now they have expanded substantially. But from the beginning, it was evident that it was going to be something that was needed, because we always had people coming. And then, you know, sadly, the circumstances of the war in Ukraine, previously the war in Syria, then Ukraine, and then all those conflicts that end up changing or shifting the place where people can be safe, meant that we could open the doors to everyone. Of course, this is not only for a particular segment of the population, everyone is invited. So we could have people who are, you know, very educated professionals. We could have people who haven't had the opportunity to have education. And what is really nice about it is the fact that everybody can be within the same space and share, you know. So that's it's quite a rewarding experience, to be honest. And then, of course, this has also allowed me to produce and to provide more opportunities to design training for the people who actually have not had those conditions in the past, the people who perhaps are not aware of what cultural awareness could be, or how is that going to impact their own organizations. So everything kind of fits together.
So are you supporting businesses to understand cultural? Yeah.
Yeah, the idea is to try to offer the opportunity for training. And we have noticed that, you know, one of the things that tends to happen is that, as I said, when this is just a tick box exercise, people don't really realize what it is. So that's where the value is. The value is on having a conversation and making sure that we could do some exercises, and that people start to believe and to understand what is it that is behind things like cultural awareness or intersectionality or equality. And when that happens, I mean, obviously they are invited to the language cafes as well, because the idea is that there is, the more awareness we can produce, the more awareness we can help to create, obviously it's going to be easier to expand that. In the language cafe, we are not only influencing the people that come to the cafe, but there's also the idea that those people are also parents, and they have families, and they have other teams and other groups. And that means that that same sense of welcoming others and understanding that others may come from different perspectives, but it doesn't stop them from creating a friendship and being in the same space, I think is very useful. The same would happen with companies and with organizations that we want to support, so that they understand their own journey. Because, of course, as much multicultural connections as there are, that means that also they are improving their alternatives and their opportunities to see things from different perspectives, and perhaps, you know, getting the advantage that that brings with it.
So are you looking for volunteers? Do you work with volunteers to support people?
We work with volunteers, and we also work with members of staff. We have been really lucky with the volunteers we have, because they are actually at the core of what we do. This is not a matter of us instructing people. It's a matter of everyone working together to produce something. It's like a co-production opportunity, basically. So yes, we do have volunteers, but when it comes to the training, we also have a lot of very experienced staff. Because, as I said, I mean, with Greg going strong for 40 years, obviously there is a lot of hands-on experience, there is a lot of cases, there is a lot of history, and there is a lot of stories as well. So all of these enters into the into the equation when it comes to produce training or to produce a way to support organizations, and especially because it's also local. So our experience is hands-on here, right here in the Northeast.
So as a charity, where does the funding come from?
That's a very good question. And I say it's a very good question because we struggle, you know, like every other charity. I'm sure that I am not alone on saying that funding is not necessarily as easy to come by as it should be, particularly because we feel that the programs and the projects that we have been doing are actually very valuable, and we can see the value on a daily basis. So we do depend on funding. The funding depends on the project as well, because like the Language Cafe, we also have, for example, a program on financial inclusion, or there are programs that are related with health among ethnic minorities. There are programs that are connected with counseling, particularly for people who have been victims of discrimination as well. So obviously the funding streams will vary depending on the project. And yes, it's very much all funded.
So donations, government funding.
We have all of them, all of the
Yeah.
above. So Greg is a charity, is a registered charity, and obviously donations would be very welcome. Some funding comes from private organizations, and some funding comes from the local government or the Scottish government.
Okay. I mean, it's great what you're doing, but
Thanks.
yeah, there's I think there's a long way to go, but we're trying to do our bit, aren't we? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice when you are able to produce or to do a job that allows you to align with your principles and with your ideals.
Mhm.
And I think the more you like, or the more those two things align, the more chances there are that you are going to continue, and you're going to have the stamina and the drive to actually continue doing it with time.
Whether it's a job or whether it's a business or
Absolutely.
you,
Yes, absolutely. You have to like what you do, don't you?
and you, yeah, if the why for you is strong enough, then you'll
Yeah.
overcome all the obstacles as well.
Yes, you become very creative as well. You know, if you cannot you know, focus on certain thing in a particular way, you try your way around until you find a way to get to where you want to be.
So you mentioned just before we started recording that you're actually an entrepreneur yourself as well. So
Yes, I am.
a bit about your own business.
Yeah, so I am a translator and an interpreter, but in general, I would say I am very passionate about anything that has to do with language. Partly the reason why things have worked so well with Greg is because it's all related with language, and I get to explore and to learn almost every day about what and how is language going to influence everything else that is happening around us. So whilst I've been working with Greg, and even before that, I advanced my studies. I am a translator and an interpreter, and I would say at this stage I consider myself to be more of a linguist, because I also teach, or got my certifications for teaching language as well, and researching as well. Sometimes, or I would say most of the time, unfortunately, because of time constraints, is not going further than anecdotal research, but there is always little bits and projects that could be interesting. So for example, at the moment, I'm trying to finish the translation of a book of poetry from an author from Argentina, which I translated from Spanish into English. And the idea is to create a document, and the author obviously supports me on this, but the idea is to create a document that is in both languages, but that also goes beyond the idea of just translating language. It's more about the things that culturally have an impact in the way that you communicate. So that's, for example, parallel to everything that happens in Greek, but is also a good way to understand how language is going to be influencing everything that you do. And if your language has a particular tone and a particular way to see things, you try to transmit that in another language, and it's not necessarily that easy. it was also related or connected with my principles, because as I was saying, it's very often that everything that we get around the world will be translated from English to whatever language. But that doesn't happen the other way around as much. So English, native English speakers will get only certain translations and certain books and certain information that has been, filtered into what is more common, into what is more popular, but not necessarily reaching out a wide audience. Because to reach a wide audience means that you will need to know about the culture, you will need explanations about why certain things are done in a certain way, and that is not always available. So I had been doing this for a long while as well, and it connects very well with what I do in Greg. And it hasn't been easy, because being a self-employed person is difficult. It requires a lot of organization of your time. It requires you to have the energy and the stamina to keep going. But when it's something that you like, you just do it, because you are not interested in just the reward. You're not interested just in making money. It's more about the pleasure of doing things that you really enjoy.
Absolutely. What are the challenges that you've had to overcome being self-employed?
Wow. Well, first of all, it was really painful to realize that there is no way that I could do that 24/7 and have a decent income, because unfortunately in the UK, the profession is not regulated. So even though we could be well qualified and have a lot of experience, we are competing with, for example, agencies that are not willing to pay our fees and are happy to pay just somebody who is bilingual to do the job of a translator. And it's not the same thing. To speak two languages doesn't mean that you can translate languages, let alone interpret. So it was I kind of have to bite the bullet, because I really wanted to be completely independent and work only as a linguist. But because of this, the market is quite unfair in terms of what I can get. So I do that part-time. But luckily, my other job is also quite there is a good level of satisfaction, so it's okay. I can cope with that. That was a big difficulty. And in terms of barriers, again, I faced discrimination, not only being a woman, but being a woman that is in this country, but is not her first language. That woman doesn't speak enough English, or her English is not good enough. But this is an interesting thing. When I moved to the UK, and after many years and having already been translating for the court, for the police, for the NHS, when I applied for my nationality, my British nationality, they require me to do another English test. And that English test was the English test that, for example, if people are going to university, they will have to show that they can speak the language, even though my qualifications were above that level. And they still require me to have that specific test, which I had to pay extra for, because, of course, it was a different test. So there is a lot of things that need to be modified, that are obstacles to begin with, but it's just a matter of navigating them and finding ways of not stopping, or not feeling that you have to stop because something is ahead of you that you think that you cannot overcome. The reality of things is that there is always ways to overcome the difficulties. You just need to be creative.
And I guess having faced these difficulties makes you a better qualified, but have the experiences that mean that you can help the people that Greg are supporting.
Yes, exactly. That was the whole thing is a steep learning curve, but all of those experiences are not going to waste. And I don't think that any entrepreneur could say that their experiences or their failures will go to waste, because the truth is that it's through those that you learn the most and you become more resilient, you become stronger. So all of those difficulties, I have heard other people telling me about them and complaining about the situation and why do I have to do this? And I think that this is unfair. And I do agree. I mean, in some cases, absolutely, it is unfair. But it doesn't mean that that needs to stop you. It doesn't mean that you need to stop dreaming or stop aiming for what you want to get, because in the end, if you really want it, you can get it.
And there's something else that I'm thinking of there. You're talking about the people that you're supporting through your language cafes and everything. These are people that maybe have come to Aberdeen through difficult circumstances or whatever. Do you see entrepreneurs there?
Yes, and actually that is something that is interesting because we're talking about the difficulties and the obstacles that you have to overcome. And one of the things that we see is that there are a lot of people who are highly qualified and they want to come and they want to get perhaps a really good job like they had in their own countries, or perhaps they want to start their own business and so on. And they got immediately disheartened when they realized that perhaps their profession was not valid in here and they will have to do a whole bunch of documents and certifications, or perhaps what they did in another country here requires many other things and they cannot just go ahead and have their own business. So it's one of the things that I think you need to learn to manage is your expectations, because things are possible, things can be done. But the thing is that your expectation when you come to a new country needs to be lower to a level where you say, first of all, I need to find my ground before I can move forward, before I can go any further. And that takes time. After living in many countries, I realized, for example, that for me to feel familiar with the country where I was living, I needed at least a year. And that year was dedicated just to learn things like, where can I find the food that I want? How do I go from point A to point B in the most convenient and efficient way? What is the weather like? How are people going to react if I ask for something? Just very simple things, but without expectations, because if you have the expectations that things are going to work the same way that they worked in your country or that they worked in the past, you are putting yourself a barrier. So one of the things that we need to often do is to help people to manage expectations in terms of what is it that they will be able to do and how. I'm not saying that is always fair. There are situations like, for example, what I'm saying about translators and interpreters, which are really unfair because, we prepare ourselves for years to get to the point where we are, and then we are competing with somebody who barely speaks two languages, and agencies don't take that into consideration, and they decide that, oh, well, that person would do, and it's cheaper than hiring a professional. And that happens in many other professions. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible. And it means that basically what you do is you produce how can I say, you produce a portfolio of your skills, of your capabilities, of your attitudes, and then you have very clear what is it that you want, because you work really hard to get it, and you need to sort of, again, translate it into what your new environment needs and how you can supply, how can you offer your services and make sure that actually that's going to be positive. So we have had cases, for example, when Ukrainian refugees came, we developed a course that was basically, because if you're going to work in a trade, in a building trade here, you need to have a particular card that says that you have passed training on health and safety. And it wasn't so much that they didn't know about health and safety, but it's the fact that obviously it was required that they pass the exam in English. And their English wasn't good enough, or they were afraid that they were not going to pass it because the timing in the exam was such that for them it was going to take longer to read it and be able to answer the exam. So the course that we set was a course that would help them to adapt to what they needed to know and they needed to do in order to get the test. Because we were not doubting that they had the capabilities and that they know about health and safety. But what we were trying to do was to show them that you just need to adapt what you already know, because what you know is already with you. You're not losing it. It doesn't matter where you go, it goes with you. It's just a matter of adapting to what the conditions are telling you that you need to adapt to be able to access what you want to access. And in some cases, again, I reiterate, some cases there is still a lot of unfairness, but we have to work for it. No, we have to work to change those things and to challenge those things. So it's always important. Organizations, for example, need to learn to challenge those things as well. In recruitment is very common, for example, and I don't know what's the situation now because I have lost a bit of contact, but if you apply online, you have to complete an application in English. Sometimes, or very often, those applications require you to complete by writing in English, open questions. But if you are a native English speaker, you can write those questions at a certain pace. If you're not a native English speaker, that's going to be harder because you will have to translate in your brain everything to put it onto paper, well, in this case, in the screen. And not only that, imagine that you are dyslexic. Imagine that you are neurodiverse. There are lots of different elements depending of your characteristics that are going to come into the equation. Imagine that you're just not a good writer, you know?
Yeah. So it's awareness again, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like how this process that this business has
Yeah.
is actually, because there's so that if we're just thinking about recruitment or thinking about talent, you know, so many people complaining that there's not enough, we can't find good people and there are no good people, but actually
Yeah,
there are good people. You know
absolutely.
them, you're meeting them on a daily basis, but
Mm-hmm.
the ability for them to get into work,
Yes,
make a difference in the businesses that need them is
absolutely. And
difficult.
not only that, you know, because when you say, oh, there isn't enough talent, but the thing is that what they define as talent is the ticking of the boxes that they think that are important. And they're not realizing the potential that is there when you have something that is multicultural and diverse, where maybe a person is not going to have the same skills that they're looking for, but they have another completely different set of skills that they completely lack. And then the idea would be, okay, you are completely removing yourself from the possibility that there are other people with different ideas, with creativity, with a different perspective of the world that actually can contribute to make your organization better than what it is now.
Yeah, and the more diverse the team, the better they perform.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just the idea that you can share your point of view with other people, and you know that your point of view is going to be different from that from other people. Always, there is going to be things that you can always contribute. But if you don't get the opportunity to do that, you know, it's limiting other people, it's limiting the organization, but it's also limiting you because you don't have the opportunity to actually voice the things that you can see that others perhaps are not able to see because their background is different, because their past is different, because in one culture things would be seen differently from another culture.
So how are we going to sum this up for a message to my listeners who are, I'm hoping that they're female entrepreneurs that are looking to start, or maybe in the case of for you, it's maybe the ones that are looking to scale their business.
Mm-hmm.
What would you like to tell them about equality in Grampian region that's going to have an impact on them and their business?
Well, first of all, there's so many things, isn't it? First of all, the never to be afraid of diversity and to embrace it. Because the moment that you embrace it, you will have some really interesting discoveries that perhaps you wouldn't have access to if you were not to take them into consideration. So that is one thing. The second one about the Grampian region is that precisely the Grampian region is way more diverse than you think it is. We have a study that I could share with you. I could share the link with you, which is How Fair is the Northeast? And this has been data that we have collected over many years to see how minorities actually have the possibility to access services or how they feel about those services. So that is also an opportunity because it's also to see that perhaps there are markets they had never thought about before. And in general, I would say that just if there's any opportunity to train your groups, to train your teams, to train yourself, make sure that there is training on unconscious bias and in cultural awareness, because it's very difficult to realize that actually you have a particular way to see the world that may be preventing you from considering other ways of seeing it, considering alternatives that could be just as valid. In addition to that, well, intersectionality is a concept that is important to take into consideration because we are not talking about people who are, for example, just women. without thinking about that perhaps they belong to a particular ethnicity, that perhaps they have any characteristics related with their neurodiversity, or that they have a particular characteristic connected with their age group. So the beauty of intersectionality is that we learn to understand that we are very complex as human beings, and that there are lots of things that we have to do and not only one thing. So when you say that, you know, your audience will be female, it's not just that they're female, it's just all of those characteristics and all those things that play together and make you who you are. And as an individual, obviously that is very valuable, but even more when you know that that individuality is yours, but that everybody else around you will be different, and that those things, you know, sprout of on a wealth of variety, a wealth of diversity that should be tackled rather than ignored.
So I'm thinking, if going back to that workshop that I did was a participant in last week, where we're changing gender at 30, I think maybe we have to change ethnicity at 40, and
for example, and even more. I mean, think about it. If you think about our ethnicities, and I say, well, now imagine that you are not from here. Imagine that you're from my country. Probably you don't know anything about my country. And then you will be thinking, oh, but how do I do that? You know, because you know, with gender is kind of apparent, not so much when it comes to cultures. Yeah. And the view that we have about a culture is very much biased on what we have seen on television, on what has been portrayed in the media, but never the reality of it, because we haven't lived it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it works both ways, I suppose. You know, for example, for us here and the people that are coming to Northeast of Scotland, you know, their understanding of the Northeast of Scotland will not be what they were expecting. I bet they weren't expecting Doric for language for starters.
That's right.
And yeah, so yes.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. I mean, people who come to this country, and I'm obviously generalizing here, but in general, they are really keen on learning about the place where they are. And you would be the same. Say, imagine that all of a sudden they tell you, well, you have to go and live in, I don't know, Paraguay. Well, you will be interested in knowing about Paraguay. You will be interested that if you're going to have to live there, you want to know more about it. You want to know what is behind, what's the history and so on, because you know that will give you some context. So, you know, it's an opportunity missed very often, but it's also the element of respecting the place where the other ones are at. So it's not about trying to make people comply or become Scottish, because it's not that. It's about opening the doors to show them what's there and explain why is it that certain things are the way that they are. Not all of them are unchallengeable. Does this word exist? Most of the things can be challenged to be improved. It doesn't matter what culture, but it's just the idea that we need to be more welcoming. And they are very welcoming. They are really keen on learning about Scotland, but learning about a place doesn't mean that you have to turn into that person. Doesn't mean that you have to, you know, renounce everything that makes you create this place of comfort. It's more about the exchange, and to create an exchange that is free and is mutual. There is no domination of one culture over the other. That's basically the point.
I could talk to you all day. There's another example in my head where I was watching Strictly Come Dancing on Saturday, and the Glaswegian Indian doctor was doing the Indian dance on Strictly. It was the first time that you know, she was very proud to be showing her culture to all of the UK, if you like. Yeah, there
is an element of pride in our culture, because it's part of who we are. It's part of our identity. Why would you want us to change that? Why would you want us to, you know, abandon that completely to assume something different? It will be a waste for everybody. It will be a shame for everybody.
Like I said, I could talk to you all day. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Is there anything else you would like to add before we finish?
Well, if there is any interest in training on the topics that I have mentioned, I am very happy to provide information. Obviously, if that is of interest to everyone, we have a wealth of resources as well, and we are always very happy to share them as well. That will be all, I think, because I could also tell you lots of things and go on and on and on. So, yeah.
It's been lovely to talk with you.
Thank you very much.
I'll put some contact details in the show notes so that if anybody's interested
Absolutely.
in finding out more.
Yeah, and if you want, as I said, I mean, we have this link to the study that has been going on for a while, and I think that could be quite interesting for some people because it's learning about how fair is the Northeast as well.
Yeah, we'll share that also.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Scale Her Up, the Female Entrepreneurs Show. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and join our Facebook community at Scale Her Up. Please connect with me, Brenda Hector, on social media and drop me a message to let me know how you're enjoying the podcasts, or even better, pop up a review. I'll finish by reminding you that only 1 in 3 UK entrepreneurs are female, and men are 5 times more likely to scale their business to over 1 million in turnover than women are. If we started and scaled our businesses to the same extent as men, it would add £250 billion to the UK economy and provide millions of jobs. Ladies, you can do it and make a massive difference.